Hey everyone! Before we begin today's episode, I would like to remind you guys again to please check out some of my other YouTube channels in the description down below. I have a Star Wars Battlefront 2 Classic Focus channel where I review custom maps and mods on the Battlefront Max channel. I do gaming reviews on the Kanoa Reviews channel, and have also recently started a Minecraft adventure channel where I play through classic adventures with friends. You can find the links in the description, and please subscribe to those channels if you like what you see.
The Third World War had been going on for such a long time now that there were now children being born and growing up in a world where the lines between friend and foe were clearly drawn. Turkey had fallen after years of resistance, essentially clearing an entire war front, with now Iraq still standing in the Middle East. The Korean front continued as it always did. Victories were only achieved for a couple of yards per turn, incenting the feeling of World War I pacing by some. The counterattack happening in the South American front ended up in failure. This was now the second counterattack from the Central East Coast that resulted in a bloodbath for NATO, fueling the hearts of the Brazilians. With Turkey fallen, some NATO forces that fought over there were now transferred to the Korean front. Higher-ups knew that this would likely be in vain though, since China and North Korea combined had millions of troops in a defensive position. Iraq turned out to be no match for the NATO forces. Once NATO had established a perimeter on the beaches of Turkey, they steamwalled towards the east and were dominant ever since. No exceptions here. And then at the end of 2028, Iraq had officially fallen as well, and thereby the Middle Eastern front came to an end. The current world war dropped from 3 front lines to 2, South America and Korea. With 2029 now underway and the Middle Eastern front ceased to exist, many people in the NATO countries were positive about the future. They hoped to get similar results elsewhere, though the more sober types were a bit more realistic regarding the Korean front. Britain called in a new phase of the war with a massive boost in military might, as many new armies had been trained and would be sent out, mostly now towards South America, since in their eyes it was in vain to fight China on their doorstep, at the same time another enemy elsewhere. With more NATO countries now heading to South America, nations like the US and Canada that had been fighting on this front for a long time hoped to finally get the breakthrough they were hoping for all these years. But France and Britain actually also sent a small invasion force towards Pakistan and head towards China from the west. But the setup was much too small, and the soldiers got eviscerated by the Shanghai Pact forces. The battles in South America continued, and victories were claimed from both factions. After a searing and sluggish war, the recent victory over Turkey and Iraq made it to where the hearts of the NATO soldiers were fueled to the point where they were willing to traverse all that harsh terrain and take down their enemy. Britain by now had a large participation in the South American war effort. Their troops brought long-requested supplies, though the overall situation did improve a little bit, with more NATO countries now being able to set their focus to just this war front. China would be a whole different story, a battle that could go on for many more years, seeing as how many fighting men were spread throughout. But though most war stories that arrived back home were from battles fought on land, the clashes being dealt at sea should also not be forgotten. Every other week another couple of vessels would be sunk, its crew never to be heard from again. With so many invasion attempts failing on the eastern shores of Brazil, NATO had much more success on their invasion on the west coast of South America, along Chile. But it did seem that with the recent increase in British forces, a strong foothold had been set with a major successful storming of several beaches that after days would be interlocked and form the official British front in South America. Multiple fleets were also still intertwined in battles amongst the seas of the Shanghai Pact territory, mostly to clear the waters in case an invasion army would be sent in. By now the year was 2031, and the war in South America still continued, though now clearly had been gaining favorable results for the NATO units. But though they were favorable in the north, the NATO armies in Chile were now being pushed back. The Shanghai Pact was surprised by the invasion done by NATO here, but the narrow front made it easy to overwhelm the invader with little to no effort. Besides just the ships that were fighting on the waters, there were also tens of thousands of people confined to the cramped spaces of the submarines, where they escorted fleets, collected intel, and pulled off surprise attacks. And all the while, the battle for Korea did not change. It was the eternal war front. Those soldiers stationed at the front wrote notes and letters calling this the limbo of Earth, the place soldiers get sent to die. But in reality, their situation was a lot less cruel than those still continuing the fight in South America. The NATO units in Chile were especially being slaughtered left and right in great numbers. Where NATO was pulling off success in other places of the continent, these soldiers were not so lucky. The irony in the whole war situation was that North Korea was still the nation with the most dead. China was literally using them as human shields, and in the meantime was probably strengthening their force back on the mainland. As 2032 began, it became very clear that NATO would eventually be victorious over the war in South America. Brazil still had a ton of men left who could fight, but the amount of ground taken by NATO units was so vast and on multiple fronts that there was no way to escape the inevitable. It might still take a year or longer to win the war in South America, but it would be an important call on what would happen next. If all NATO forces would unite at the Korean War front, or if some would lash out at the Shanghai Pact in Africa that by now still had no conflict. Though NATO had lost a lot of ground in Chile, by now reports were coming in that victories were achieved once more. The Shanghai Pact had more forces stationed here, but morale was low, with the information of NATO spreading throughout Brazil at a rapid pace. France by now imitated Britain and announced a major assault and recruitment from their home turf that would be sent out towards South America. They hoped to clear the South American war front before Christmas of 2032. In South America, there were also multiple forces and armies of the Shanghai Pact cut off from each other. This was a definite death stroke, and the amount of Brazilian soldiers that capitulated grew with each passing week. By the end of May, more armies had linked up and eradicated any Brazilian resistance. Now, not all Brazilians fought for the Shanghai Pact though. There were plenty of those labeled as rebels, who were against a third party controlling their government and had joined up with the NATO side. And then, on March 13th of 2033, Brazil capitulated. After a decade of war, rest would once again return to the scarred continent of South America. A huge wave of celebration and disbelief roamed through the NATO countries. The men and women who fought at this brutal and bloody front would be sent home to embrace in their families once more. Sons and daughters, fathers and mothers. Though the war in Brazil was over, there were still forces fighting for the Shanghai Pact in neighboring nations. Most people agreed that the South American war front would end as well. Brazil was the biggest nation to oppose the threat, and most other fighting-capable men went to hide in the jungles, sometimes to successfully pull off a cowardly surprise attack here and there. Those who did not capitulate headed towards the western coast, maybe to get into hiding, start a new life, or move somewhere else. The promise of ending the war before Christmas 2032 was not accomplished, but most were happy that the horrors at this front were over. And though these men and women would be sent home, eventually they would return to the battlefield on mainland China, the last of the Shanghai Pact resistance. The war would still continue, and more lives would be lost on both sides. But NATO knew that through hardship and sacrifice, they would eventually persevere.